Hello, it's Gino here. Today I want to look at the Schliemann defense in the Roy Lopez, or yeah, some people call it the Spanish game. And so this is a starting position, but just to see how we got here. If we start with the moves, pawn to e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, and now pawn to f5. Now if we go back one move, the more popular tries for black here are pawn to a6 and knight to f6. But pawn to f5 leads to the aggressive Schliemann defense. Now, this has some similarities with the Latvian gambit, but I think this is much better here than in the Latvian gambit. Yeah, so now White has three main continuations. So the first of these, which we'll look at, is pawn to f5. I think this is not the biggest challenge for black, but kind of illustrates black's ideas. But the other continuation as well is knight to c3. And if we go back one move, instead of knight to c3, there's also d3 as well for white. So I think those two are a little bit more challenging for black. Now after pawn takes f5, the problem for white here, well, I wouldn't say it's a problem, but it allows black comfortable play with pawn to e4. And now the key point here is that if the knight were to go back to g1, for example, then queen to g5 is already better for black. I mean, the black queen is hitting the g2 square, queen takes f5 is also possible. A move like g4 to defend the f5 pawn isn't really pretty. I mean, black can continue in a number of ways. He can go knight f6, he can go h4, he can even go h5 to undermine the pawn. So I don't think this is the right way for white to play. So going back to the position after pawn to e4. So instead of knight to g1, which we've just looked at, bishop takes c6 is another move. But I think the problem with this is that after pawn takes d6, we can see her black's pieces are all ready to spring into action. Bishop taking f5, bishop out somewhere, this bishop on f8 out somewhere, etc. So a possible continuation would be something like queen takes e2, but then after bishop takes f5, d3, queen to e7, black's actually better in this position. He's ready to castle, and he's not even material down. So going back to the position after pawn to e4, I think the main try here for white is to go queen e2. But now after the simple queen to e7, white has no way of putting more pressure on the pawn. He could try moving the knight is an admission of defeat, that the opening didn't quite go well. So he might try bishop takes c6 first. But here, black has two comfortable ways of playing. Pawn takes d6 is one way of playing. But I think I like bishop takes c6 because it allows a possible pawn to a5 and bishop to a6, threatening the white queen in the future. So after this exchange on c6, knight to d4 is now possible. And now, something you need to be aware of, there is a line, a drawish line that goes queen to e5, threatening the knight. And the point is that if knight goes back to f3, queen to e7, and it turns out black doesn't actually have a better move than to go back to d4. I mean, knight to g1, for example, would be met by d5 with a better advantage for black. I mean, he's going to regain his pawn, and look, he has control of the central squares. So yeah, so just going back to the position after queen to e5 and knight to d4, knight to f3, queen to e7, and knight to d4, queen to e5 would be a drawing continuation. Okay, so going back to the position after knight to d4, if black does not want to take the draw with queen to e5, he has this continuation knight to f6, which is also a good continuation. He develops another piece. Yeah, and he's going to regain a pawn at on f5 at some point. So yeah, after something like knight to f6, it's just worth pointing out here that pawn to d3 is not a very good try for white, because white's pawn structure would be damaged after, say, pawn takes d3 and pawn takes d3, or queen takes e7 first, bishop takes e7, pawn takes d3, and I mean, there's not a lot that white can do to stop white from regaining either the f5 or d3 pawn. This is a better position for black. So going back to the position after knight to f6, we've just seen d3 is not such a great idea. So white is probably best advised to castle kingside. But now queen to e5, and after knight to f3, queen takes f5, and black is more than okay, if not slightly better. And now the point here is that after, say, something like d3, try to take advantage of the pin on the e file, bishop a6, this kind of illustrates why one of the benefits of playing b takes c6 rather than d takes d6. So there's the pin on the queen, and the thing here is that a move like what do you call it, c4, to try and stop the bishop from x-raying the queen could well, it could be met several ways. Black can actually castle queen side, exclamation mark, because after pawn takes e4, knight takes e4 would be very comfortable for black. Or if we go back a move, black can even afford to play pawn to d5. And the point here is pawn takes d5 is impossible because the bishop takes d3, so that would be a bit silly. And pawn takes e4 would simply be made by pawn takes e4 with a comfortable position for black. So going back to the position after pawn to d3 and bishop to a6, white can probably also try rook to e1. But after the simple castles kingside, we see that black has a more than comfortable position. In fact, he is slightly better in this position. If you can imagine, none of the pieces on white's queen side have developed, but black has nearly completed his development. So just going back to that open position after f5, going back to position after f5, we see the pawn takes f5 doesn't give black any problems whatsoever. So let's look at the other two moves, which I think give black a much more difficult task. So the first one we should look at, I think, is d3, because this is a move that someone who isn't familiar with the position might play. And now here you'd have to go pawn takes f4, I think, and then after pawn takes e4, knight to f6, hitting the pawn on e4, and here castles by white. So the justification for this move is obviously that knight takes e4 is impossible because of rook e1, and if knight back to f6, bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6, and knight takes e5, threatening some devastating discovered attacks. This would be winning for white. So going back to the position after castles, instead of playing this ill-advised move, knight takes e4, I think the key move for black here is bishop to c5. Now, the problem that black has in this line is illustrated after bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6. So we go with the b pawn rather than the d pawn because we don't want to exchange queen. And knight takes e5. So this is a small problem. The fact that white ends up with an extra pawn. But as we'll see, black probably gets just about enough compensation for it. So castle's kingside is the main move. And after a standard developing move like knight c3, just simply pawn to d6, chasing the knight back. Now the knight has to go back to d3 because something like knight takes c6 would be simply be met by queen e8. And after knight d4, knight takes e4. Yeah, and even though black's a pawn down, he has the two bishops, and yeah, he'll have a lot of compensation for it. So after something like knight takes e4, queen takes e4, and say c3, defending the knight on e4, queen g6, and yeah, I think black is in time with his threats. You know, bishop to h3, for example, is a threat. Rook e1, for example, black can just go bishop g4. And yeah, this leads to a dynamically equal game. Yes, so it's worth investigating this one on your own. But yeah, black's a pawn down, but he's got very active pieces and should be able to keep the balance. So yeah, so just going back to that position after pawn to d6, instead of knight takes c6, knight to d3 is the main move, but then bishop to d4, threatening to capture on c3, and at least, you know, ruin white's pawn structure is a move. Hence the move knight to e2. But after bishop to b6, I think you can just take stock of this position. The pawn on e4 is threatening. Black has the two bishops and they're pointing towards white's king. So yeah, black just has just about enough for the pawn, but yeah, as with practical chess, you have to be careful and you have to gain some experience of playing these positions out. Bishop to g5 is a possible continuation from white to try and deal with this threat to the e4 pawn, but then queen e8 steps out the pin and keeps an eye on the e4 pawn. And if something like bishop takes f6, rook takes f6, and maybe knight g3 to hold a pawn, we end up with a position where you got two bishops versus two knights. And usually the two bishops are superior to two knights in a wide open position. So I'd say black just about has compensation for the pawn, for the missing pawn. So that was the move d3. Going back to the position after f5. So we looked at e takes f5, we looked at d3. The main move, and I think this is the biggest test, is the move knight to c3. So in this position, again, as with pawn to d3, I think black should go pawn takes e4, and after knight takes e4, knight f6. Now the main continuation here is knight takes f6, queen takes f6, and then something worth knowing is that after queen e2, black has to acknowledge that the e5 pawn is a goner. There's no point trying to defend it with d6. He should just go bishop e7 in this position, and I'll show you why. Pawn to d6 would simply be met by d4 with a crushing attack for black. He doesn't have sufficient counterplay. So for example, d5 already is threatened. Bishop takes c6 and pawn takes e5 is threatened. Just to give you one line, bishop to d7, trying to deal with the pin, would simply be met by pawn to d5. And here, black's best tries to go knight to b8. But the thing is, yeah, white has a long line that's been analyzed to bits that involves an attack with what do we call it? Knight to g5, knight to e6. Black won't be able to play bishop takes e6 because of this pin on the diagonal. And here, this would be terrible, absolutely terrible, because of this weak pawn on b7. So just going back to the position after queen to e2. The key move you need to remember as black here is to give up the pawn on e5 with bishop to e7, and hope for some compensation with the bishop pair. So for example, after bishop takes c6, b takes c6. Just going back a move, you're probably wondering why not d takes c6. Well, d takes c6 is possible, but I prefer this is possible, but I prefer b takes c6 because in some lines you want the bishop to be able to cause havoc on this diagonal. Pawn to d4 is an active way for white to play. I mean, you're probably wondering, well, why doesn't white just play knight takes e5? Well, knight takes e5 is possible as well. But I think if we go back and move, I think by playing d4 first, white's trying to make the most positions, trying to tempt black to go pawn takes d4 when bishop to g5 would be, you know, a very difficult position to meet. So for example, after queen to e6, queen takes e6, pawn takes e6, bishop takes e7, and knight takes e7, and knight takes d4. Yeah, black's pawn structure is terrible, and yeah, this will be very, very painful to defend in an actual game. So yeah, going back to the position after pawn to d4. So white's just played pawn to d4. Here, I think black should just simply play the move queen to g6. Yeah, stepping away from any pawn takes e5 ideas. Also, this queen on g6 is hitting the g2 square. So here, white is best advised to castle. But then after d6, pawn takes e5 on 0-0. And we end up in a position where, again, black has got one less pawn, but he's got the bishop pair in an open position. So a possible continuation is pawn takes d6, bishop to h3, threatening mate on g2. So here white would be forced to play queen to c4 check, and after queen to h8, knight to e1, covering the g2 square. And now in this position, after knight to e1, obviously black has to do something about the bishop on e7, so bishop takes d6. And then after queen to c3, there have actually been quite a few games where black has played bishop to e6 and gone on to lose. But actually here, I think an improvement is move bishop to g4, because there's a simple threat of bishop to e2, winning the exchange. Now, the key thing to point out here is that f3 isn't possible. Well, it is possible, but it'll be well met by rook a to e8. And the point is that pawn takes g4 is impossible because of bishop takes f2 check. Ouch. King takes h2, rook takes f1. Is much better for white. So just going back to the position after bishop to g4, rather than go f3, yeah, the better move for black here is to go f4. yeah, black will play rook a to e8 again. So yeah, in this position, black's a pawn down. He has a terrible pawn structure, but he'll have to make the most of his bishop pair in this position. It's just worth pointing out here that after a move like queen takes c6 would not be very good because of, well, for several reasons. Bishop to e2 is a simple one, and the point is that if rook goes to f2, queen to h5, something like queen to c3, and bishop to c5 would win the exchange. So just to recap, if we go to the starting position after f5, e takes f5 doesn't cause black any problems at all after the continuation with e4, queen e2, and queen e7, etc. D3 would lead to a game where black ends up a pawn down, but with active, compensation with the bishop pair. And then going back here, knight to c3, which I think is the more dangerous of the three tries, would also lead to a position where black is down material, but would be relying on the bishop pair and piece activity in an open position. So yeah, I hope you liked this one. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hope to see you on the next one.